The Final Fantasy series is one of the best known, most prolific, longest running series in gaming. It's really popular, it's really successful. So every time Square releases a new game in the series, it's under a lot of scrutiny, it's inevitably very popular, and it's also has to be considered under very high standards, because every time the company releases a new game in the series, if nothing else, it looks a lot better than every game that has come before it. These games really raise the bar in terms of production values that can be expected from games. They're really just, by now, they're so cinematic and so dramatic that few games really can compete. We've all seen screenshots and movies of it and all that kind of stuff really for months now, leading up to the release of the game for the PlayStation 2. The reason it's a particularly significant game, as if it being called Final Fantasy isn't significant enough, is because it's Square's first Final Fantasy for sort of a next-generation platform for the PlayStation 2, as opposed to the PlayStation before it. So just like Final Fantasy VII really revolutionized the series for the PlayStation, it really introduced a whole new type of look to the series. People are sort of expecting Final Fantasy X to do the same with the PlayStation 2. For the most part, it really does a lot of that. It's just a very impressive looking, big, grand production, and it really looks the part. But of course, we sort of knew that already. We've seen the screenshots. The question is, how does it play? Does it really stack up? Is it as long as the previous games in the series and that sort of thing? And by and large there, the answer is yes. It has a very interesting combat system, a lot of great characters, a story that turns out to be very interesting. The game itself is very long, surprisingly long. In fact, it's even longer than many of its predecessors. It'll probably take you no less than 40 hours if you're a veteran of the series, and probably as long as 50. And that's without even going through a lot of the side quests, a lot of the optional stuff that could easily end up doubling the amount of time you spend with the game. The game uses a turn-based combat system like every other Final Fantasy game before it. You have 3 characters active at any given time, but you actually, in most cases, have access to your entire party of characters. Early on in the game, you pretty much meet all your friends, and you have more than half a dozen characters in your team. So what happens is you can swap one character in for another, and although you only have the 3 guys up front fighting whatever it is you're fighting, you can always call someone else in for reinforcements. The game still ends if you lose all 3 characters who are active, so it's not an entirely it's not entirely logical. Like why don't those other guys come in and help? But it actually helps gameplay a lot, because these battles last a long time anyway, and if they were balanced, to face them with like 7 characters rather than just 3, then they'd take even longer. As it is, the combat system works quite well. It's very, very strategic, very tactical. You have you get to see now the order in which your characters are going to move in. You'll see that you'll get 2 turns and then the enemy is going to go. So you'll have to anticipate what the enemy is going to do and try to get prepared for that. The Final Fantasy series is really popular, but that's not to say it doesn't have some detractors. It's not, beyond reproach. Some people have criticized the series, particularly since Part 7, for being very time-consuming. You have these really drawn-out battle sequences where you're seeing these admittedly incredible-looking spell effects going off and all kinds of things happening, but the battles sort of, some people think the battles sort of drag on, and they wish the game would kind of snap to it and move a little bit faster. Of course, fans of the series really love the more leisurely pacing, the sort of epic nature of the game. And Final Fantasy X, to be sure, does follow in the tradition of the more recent games in the series. it is a time-consuming game. It's not something you could just play for 5 or 10 minutes at a time. It's something you kind of have to hunker down with and spend a good few hours with if you're going to get anywhere, because, you know, especially in the second half of the game, you'll start fighting some of these battles that really take quite some time to get through. The character advancement system in Final Fantasy X is actually really interesting and both open-ended and somewhat confining at the same time. It looks really intimidating at first. You don't just gain levels like you do in most RPGs, but rather you gain these points that you could then use to move around this big kind of confusing looking map called the sphere grid. The way it works is every time you move a place on this grid, you move next to these spaces that you could then purchase using these little spheres that you find. And every time you purchase one of these, they do various things, like they'll raise your strength or they'll raise your hit points and so on. So you don't just gain a level and, you know, get more strength and get more hit points. You just gain these things one bit at a time. And the way it works is you have the different characters in your team, and they'll start out at different points in this gigantic grid. So Lulu, your magic user, she'll start out next to where a lot of different spells are, so she'll naturally be more inclined to learn these spells than the other characters. Eventually, late in the game, you'll be able to move all across this map and have everyone kind of get good at everything. But the game does sort of lock you into particular paths of advancement for each character. And again, this ends up working quite well. You don't have it so that all your characters kind of feel exactly the same way. They definitely have their own specialties and their own best skills and so forth. The game isn't all just combat, of course. There are several puzzle sequences. You go to these various temples along the way, and you have to sort of manipulate various objects there to unlock their hidden secrets, and this involves, you know, kind of plugging these magic jewels into different places. They're kind of a diversion. They're a bit time-consuming, but during these times, you know, you're not doing any combat, there's no time pressure and so on. It's a nice change of pace. In fact, there's a lot of stuff in Final Fantasy X that, you know, it makes for a clever diversion, and there's a game called Blitzball that's very popular in the world of the game. It's sort of an underwater soccer, and one point relatively early in the game you have to play Blitzball, but throughout the rest of the game it's optional. You can choose to, you know, compete in these tournaments of the game, and it's kind of this little half real-time, half turn-based sports game that's kind of fun. You know, it's not as interesting as the rest of Final Fantasy X, but it's a pretty interesting mini game, and there's other stuff there like chocobo racing and trying to capture monsters that are loose in the wilderness and bring them back to like a monster trainer and all kinds of stuff like that. This is stuff that fans of the series are going to want to spend a lot of time with, but otherwise it's very optional.
A city dead for 1,000 years. A city I had to see with my own eyes.
It may not seem like a big deal, but the fact that there's spoken dialogue in Final Fantasy X actually is a very significant thing for fans of the series, because this is the first ever Final Fantasy game where characters actually speak. So one of the big questions about the English translation is, well, how is the voice acting? The good news is that the voice acting is surprisingly well done. Most of the voices match the characters very well. You'll actually grow to like the characters just based on the sound of their voice. They'll really, you know, sound the part. Not all the dialogue is perfect. Some of it sounds more convincing than other parts, but by and large, the game makes very good use of speech. I don't think fans of the series who've been wary about the English voice acting are going to be disappointed with the quality of it. Well, it practically goes without saying that Final Fantasy X looks amazing. It is worth pointing out that the graphics in some areas they're a bit mixed. The game uses pre-rendered cinematics in some sequences that look really unbelievably good, but at the same time the characters in these scenes, they look noticeably different. You could tell different artists did these pre-rendered scenes than did the in-game stuff. In the in-game portion, during dialogue between some of the characters and many of the non-interactive cutscenes that occur throughout Final Fantasy X, you'll see that sometimes the characters' faces look incredibly detailed. These are easily the best-looking characters you've ever seen on the PlayStation 2. And at other times during battle and even just while running around, the character models aren't quite as detailed. That said, the different scenes, all the scenery in Final Fantasy X, it just looks gorgeous. The monsters, are just these really wild-looking things. You'll see a lot of the same stuff that you've seen in previous Final Fantasy games, although with, kind of completely new looks to them. A lot of the old favorite summoned creatures like Ifrit and Bahamut come back with all new looks. It's a lot of fun to look at, no matter if you're a veteran of the series or not. Well, it's very easy to recommend Final Fantasy X for any number of different kinds of people. Final Fantasy fans will, of course, eat it up. They're not interested in this review anyway, they're just going to go out and buy it. People looking for a great role-playing game for the PlayStation 2, well, here it is. Here's this big, huge game. There's really nothing else comparable to it on the system. People who are fans of role-playing in general will like it a lot. The game just tells a great story and is nice and long, and you'll remember it even after all the time you've spent playing it. It'll stick with you. So if you've been wary, has Square lost its touch? Can Final Fantasy X possibly stack up to the previous games in the series? Well, rest assured that it most certainly does.